All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out to Sturgis Library tonight on one of the last days of August. It's beautiful out, but you're all choosing to stay inside with us. We really appreciate that, so thank you. Let's talk about Lee for a moment. So, Lee Roscoe is an award-winning environmentalist and educator, a former equity actress who's appeared off-Broadway and in independent films as well as on Cape Cod. I edited that wrong. She is a playwright whose work has been seen from New York to Provincetown, and a longtime journalist with hundreds of published pieces on arts, history, environment, and the news. She's the author of Dreaming Monomoy's Past, Walking Its Present, a subjective and objective look at the link between nature, culture, and history in the coastal area. That's on the table back there if you want to check it out. So let's welcome Lee to the podium.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. This is a kind of imagist free-for-all talk on mooncussing and how it relates to my radio play, The Mooncussers' Tale. The Mooncussers' Tale was broadcast on WOMR Halloween of 2018 and again this June. It is available on podcast in the WOMR.org archive for podcasts. It's an 80-minute radio play based on the legends of mooncussing on Cape Cod. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the play itself. But this talk is about mooncussing. The Cape was, a couple of hundred years ago, really a place of ocean. If you lived on the Cape, the way you got around was in your little lugger, your small sailboat. You really weren't using the coach roads, you were walking or sailing. If you looked out into the waters around the Cape, you would have been seeing from the 1600s through the 1900s all kinds of sailing vessels. You would have been seeing schooners and sloops. They might have been fishing in the near shore. You would have been seeing, of course, still you would have been seeing the Wampanoag Michuans, the canoes that they used to fish, visit, and trade with. You would have seen the three-masted pinnaces such as the Mayflower and the small shallops that descended from them, fishing and colonizing. And you would have seen two-masted brigs and brigantines, topsail schooners in the coastal trades and down to the Caribbean, three-masters, frigates for war, ships, snows, whaling barks, barkentines. And from those vessels occurred, because of our violent waters, many, many a wreck. In fact, according to the Cape Cod National Seashore, 1,000 to 3,000 wrecks might circle the Cape, many of them on the backside, the Atlantic side, the graveyard of the Cape, although some wrecks did go down in the bay as well. So here on the Cape, the gray skies, the clouds, the storms and the seas, and that water kind of lives in us, and it lives in the tale that I wanted to tell. And before technology, before the Cape Cod Canal was originally built in the early 1900s, it was really treacherous to get around the Cape by sail. I always think there was more danger, but in a way it was wilder, freer, and untamed. The men who worked these vessels, perhaps some of you are descended from them. They were incredibly capable, brave, knowledgeable in geography, the night skies, and boys would go to sea as young as 10 or 11 to start to learn the trade. But ships wrecked, as I said, often in our storming high seas, because particularly before the canal, it was really treacherous to circle the whole Cape. You could not go through, and you could get caught in some horrible rips, get grounded on shoals, and go down in storms. There were storms so vicious that they occasionally even pulled secure lightships, which were big metal container ships there to be kind of lighthouses and guides in the 19th century and early 20th century. The storms sometimes were so bad they could pull those lightships off of their chains and disappear. Still, in the early 1800s, from the 1700s through the 1800s through the 1900s, but we know in the 1800s there was an average of 2 wrecks every month during the winter. So when Champlain went around the Cape, it was so bad he named the backside of the Cape, Cape Malabar, Cape Bad Bars, and someone named the rips around Monomoy Island, which was a terrific hassle to go past, Tucker's Terror. That was William Sears Nickerson who reported it as such. And some of the worst shoals and waters were from P-Town to Wellfleet, in particular the Peaked Hill Bars, which was lit up eventually by the Cape Cod or Highland Light, and the Shank Painter, Long Point, and Chatham Bars. We've got lists of wrecks, mile long. Famous wrecks include, I'm just going to kind of press this as I go. It's not necessarily related to, we have the wrong thing here, complete techno dud. See if I get this right here. Forgive me. There we go. Yeah, speaking of seas. So some of the famous wrecks that we have around the Cape include the Sparrow Hawk in the 1600s. I want to say that these images are not related to what I'm talking about, but they are related to the images that eventually went into the Mooncusser's tale. So it's a little bit of a disconnect, but bear with me. We had the Sparrow Hawk in the 1620s. We had the El Prince, a Dutch man of war. We had the Josephus, a British ship near what would become the Highland Light. The Bark Francis near High Head, the famous Portland wreck during the Portland Gale in the late 1800s. The barge Wadena in the 1900s near Monomoy. From the head of the Meadow Beach at North Truro, the wreck of the Bark Francis, sunk in a December gale in 1872, is still seen at low tide. For more on these wrecks, you can go to Edwin Rowe Snow's books and to William Quinn. It's a fascinating subject in and of itself. So a lot of these vessels were carrying something that was enticing to people ashore, that was namely cargo and goods. The Cape was, in the first couple of hundred years, pastoral and maritime, and there were self-sufficient farmers, sometimes called corn crackers, who farmed in the warm weather, fished for mackerel and cod close to shore or further out. They may have shore whaled. They may have traded what they caught locally or coastally in small packet vessels. They were generalists. They were fisher farmers. I did a piece on Captain Benjamin Bangs, who was the quintessential 18th century Cape Codder farmer, fisherman, merchant for the Cape Cod Genealogical Society Bulletin, if you want to learn more about what that life was like. So there were farm goods. There were furs, tar, pitch for shipbuilding, spermaceti, candles, whale oil, livestock. These were things that could be traded down the coast and even across the Atlantic. Wool, wool cloth, woolen mills, milled wool, lumber, floorboards of pine, firewood, furniture, leather goods, hides, flax, and of course the famous salt cod and rum that was part of the infamous triangle trade, where they would go down and trade for slaves in return for molasses and sugar to make rum at home and trade it back. Again, a whole other subject and a blight on our historical conscience. They would trade and bring home tobacco, corn, dyes such as indigo, rice, corn, wheat, flour, cotton, pork, wine, salt. And in the 1700s and 1800s, captains from the Cape, who were often in the employ of Boston merchants, went to Europe and China, Africa, and beyond, People such as the Wellfletian Lorenzo Dow Baker traded mining equipment and lumber for bananas, and began the infamous United Fruit in 1871 was the start of it. So when a ship wrecked, my point is, this meant a bonanza for finders keepers along the shore, and for what were licensed salvagers. Salvagers were licensed by towns to go out and clean up the wrecks and get some of those goods back to the owners. There were deals with insurance brokers, and it was a kind of complex business. But of course, a lot of that stuff, allegedly no proof, but books say a lot of that stuff that was salvaged ended up in the pockets and in the stores of Cape Codders. Cape Codders were a poor lot. If you read Thoreau, you know, and other historians, that in the 17 and 1800s and early 1900s, we were not a wealthy area. And so there could be a little bit of desperation as to where your next meal was going to come from. And this was a bounty to be able to collect this stuff. So, allegedly, some of these ships got a little help in being wrecked. And this is where the Mooncussers came in. They were land pirates, and they would set up false lights to confuse vessels so that they would run aground, break apart, and those aboard would drown and leave their goods to drift ashore, or the vessels could be boarded by criminals in small dories coming aboard using grappling hooks and rope ladders, and they would steal the goods off the ship and allegedly sometimes murder the sailors. I'm going to get into whether there's any proof of this, but let's go through first what it was and how they did it. So they mooncussed in various ways. The reason the name is Mooncussing is because they cursed the moon when it came out and lit the waters on a good night, because then you could navigate the treacherous shoals and bars of the Cape. On a dark and stormy night, not so much. And so mariners would rely on beacon lights ashore to guide them. They would rely on early pilotages before there were lighthouses and life-saving stations. Some of those pilotages were such as, I have to look at my notes, but there was an early lighthouse at Tarpaulin Cove, which was privately owned in the mid-1700s. There was Betty's Pilotage, which was another privately owned kind of tavern and pilotage somewhere near Chatham. That means that people would voluntarily bring out lights, stand on the shore, and try to guide vessels through treacherous waters into harbor. So fake lights could imitate real beacons of safety, such as pilot vessels, which were also a means to get ships safely into shore, small dories with lights on them, those pilotages ashore that I mentioned, or later lighthouses. And these lights could be put on bluffs ashore, on dories, they could be handheld, or they could even be strung on horses. As I said, the idea was to lead a vessel to ground on dangerous shoals where they could be marauded. There are some examples, as one source eloquently says. As a ship's captain saw this gently bobbing light, it seemed to be from a ship riding at anchor in a sheltered harbor. As the captain tried to put into this safe harbor, his ship would pile up on the treacherous shoals that constantly rise and change shape beneath the surface. The land pirates made the crew walk the plank, looted and burned the hapless ship, and made away with the bounty. In the book Yankee Coast about Maine, some said, the book says, that there was a hermit who built bonfires at night to compete with halfway rock light, and so brought storm-bound vessels ashore. They could build bonfires on the beaches. One description says, by building a large sand dune and standing on top with a fire inside a barrel, and by opening and closing the barrel, the light appeared to be a lighthouse from the ocean. Ships would steer toward the supposed lighthouse, believing it to be another waterway, and end up crashing into shore. They could be misled by link boys, this happened particularly in England, who roved with lights to pilot ships from shore and misled those ships onto sandbars or rocks, as the folklorist Botkin records, carrying torches of tow and pitch. Link boys would light you into a pack of rogues. By placing lanterns on the back of a horse ashore, imitating the appearance of a ship bobbing in the water, also they could lead vessels astray. So historically, these Mooncussers practiced from the 1600s to the War of 1812. And it was not only, by the way, the moon that mariners needed, but Thoreau talks about the Big Dipper and North Star being used for night steering before modern instruments proliferated in the 1760s. And when they were obscured, it could mean really big trouble. As late as 1857, Thoreau speaks of captains who cursed the lone fishermen's lights for confusing them into running aground. And so if even legitimate lights on shore or on beacon ships can confuse navigating ships, you can imagine what a mist, a freak blizzard, a hurricane, how a well-set group of luring lights were almost certain to misguide a vessel. So what were the reasons to wreck a ship deliberately? Well, one was war. Orleans, Rock Harbor, and around Boat Meadow Creek, during the Revolution and the War of 1812, small vessels would be secreted, and schooners and sloops would be sent out to harass the British. They would also run Jefferson's 1807 embargo prior to the War of 1812 in order to go out and get much-needed salt. But it's possible that there was some engagement in deliberate wrecking as well. Another reason, greed. As I said, you could keep the loot from the cargoes. You could keep the gold in the hold, the wood, the spars, the appurtenances of the vessels themselves. And insurance was another reason. There are accounts, I'm going to read one if we have time later, one in particular, the Franklin, by Thoreau and the Atlantic Monthly, which asserted that at least one ship was wrecked deliberately and mooncussed, both for the insurance and the goods that could be resold to the merchants in charge of the vessel. So we do have some whereabouts of these Mooncussers. They operated from Sable Island in Canada down to Florida, the North Shore of Massachusetts and our South Shore, Maine and down to Long Island and New Jersey. Cape May had a particularly bad reputation for mooncussing, and in England. The barrier islands of the Carolinas, such as Nag's Head, were particular venues for mooncussing. And in fact, Nag's Head was named for a horse which mooncussed with Judas lanterns hung on him up and down the dunes, misleading vessels. There are some actual episodes of mooncussing. They're scarce, but there are a few. In historic Ipswich, we hear of a Henry Maine who turned to plundering wrecked ships for a living, an enterprise he probably practiced before coming to Ipswich. He and his partners would plunder the wrecks for their cargo, and it was rumored they would finish off any victims they found still alive. They used the sandbar extending from Plum Island, known as the Ipswich Bar. Eventually discovered, caught, and tried, legend says that as punishment, Harry was sentenced to be chained to a stake in the Ipswich Bar and shovel sand for eternity, or at least until he drowned. His ghost appeared, and when the waves crashed over the bar during the storms, locals would say, "The devil is raising Old Harry," or "Old Harry's growling again." His yells and rage could be heard for miles around. And I love this the best. He allegedly buried his treasure from his misdeeds out there. But one time when a man began digging and unearthed an iron bar lying beside a flat stone, as he began prying on the stone, an army of black cats appeared and glared at him with eyes of fire. And he disappeared quickly, and the feline guardians disappeared as quickly. And then icy water began pouring into the hole, preventing the treasure from being uncovered. In 1835, which is the very date of the Mooncussers' tale, my radio play, it's when it takes place, 40 people were actually indicted in Barnegat, New Jersey, including 2 justices of the peace, for mooncussing the James Fisher and the Henry Franklin, robbing the cargoes and passenger. And this gang had been accused of turning their back on shipwreck victims and demanding money from their families in return for their corpses. A ship which crashed near Wellfleet, a little closer to home, spreading its English cargo of tea around the time of the Boston Tea Party, may have wrecked, not entirely of natural fate. Again, I mentioned war as a patriotic reason for mooncussing vessels. And the famous wreck of the English warship, the Somerset, during the Revolution on the Provincetown bars was quite likely manufactured by Cape Codders as well. Other episodes in the Cape, and I mention 1 or 2 of these in my book, Dreaming Monomoy's Past. Chatham, Monomoy was particularly rife, allegedly, with mooncussing. One legend was of a man who hung those Judas lanterns on his innocent white stallion, wrecking many a vessel. But he himself was caught in a storm, crossing from Monomoy back to Chatham, and he and the horse drowned. And the ghosts were seen up until about 1984 around Monomoy. There were accounts. Another version says that, no, it was a mare, evil-tempered from eating a clergyman's pasture grass, ingesting the spirits of the damned around the place, which threw its wrecker rider one night, after which there appeared a white riderless ghost horse galloping about on Monomoy and across Stage Harbor, all through the 1800s and into the 1900s. And it would be a presager of wrecks. We mentioned the Somerset, but also when British Captain Cyprian Southack in the early 18th century took his boat down Jeremy's Gutter to try to find the plunder from the Whydah wreck, which wrecked in the early 1700s. And, excuse me, everybody here knows what the Whydah is, I'm assuming. I'll get into it a little bit, but he started obsessively violating everybody's rights by entering houses to find the loot of the pirate Black Bellamy, who was the captain of the Whydah and who had perished in the wreck. So Cape Codders angrily called him the greatest mooncurser. So it was Bellamy's famous pirate ship, a former slave galley, the Whydah, according to one account, was wrecked, more than one actually, was wrecked by the captain of a snow, captured by a Bellamy, who got his revenge by mooncusser techniques. He threw a lighted tar barrel into the water in the pretense of guiding the black ship out of Provincetown in poor weather, and instead deliberately guided her to break up on Wellfleet's devastating backside shoals where it wrecked. I'm quoting here, there is an old Indian tradition that sometime before the settlement of Nantucket Island by whites, a French ship having on board a large quantity of specie, that's gold, coin, came ashore on the east end of the island in a storm and was driven up the gulch. After getting the treasure ashore and burying it, the survivor, and it may or may not have been mooncussed, but after getting the treasure ashore, the survivors cut their way through heavily forested area to reach Indian settlements. And giving substance to this story is that there's been a lot of digging in that beach in the past 100 years. It's not really a mooncusser story, but it is a treasure story, and I will talk a little bit about treasure on the Cape in a minute. There was also the strange case of Ansel Nickerson, who was found aboard a fishing schooner with 4 murdered men, and all the loot was gone. And there was great supposition that this had been a moon-cursed vessel, and it had been boarded and the loot was stolen, and that Nickerson was part of the plot. But he was defended by, guess who? Anybody know? He was defended by John Adams, none other than, in 1772, and he got off. So we mentioned the wreck Franklin, which was Mooncuss for insurance. So the story of the wreck of the Franklin, which took place the previous spring, I'm not sure what the date was on that, but the prior spring to whatever the date in the 1800s was. There was a vessel in distress, and he, being an old man, and this is an account by Thoreau, first ate his breakfast, walked to the top of the hill by the shore, sat down, and having found a comfortable seat, saw the ship wrecked. It's a rather long passage, but the passengers, some of them were saved, and a lot of stuff that came off the wreck ended up being planted ashore, turnips, beets, and plums. And yes, the insurance money ended up being more valuable than the cargo for the vessel. So, is it true? Did we mooncuss? Well, Kittredge in Mooncussers of Cape Cod, as did other historians, Snow and Samuel Morrison, or 2 others at least, claimed there was nary a one. Instead, they were all wreckers, salvagers, finders, keepers. And from my own book, there's little but the tattered fragments of an oral tradition to support these doings. However, once in a while you'll talk to an old family, and they'll kind of admit that they have some stuff in the attic, like grappling irons and ladders, but I have never gotten anyone to cop to it. So if anybody here, there's no statute of limitations. I don't know if there is or isn't, but yeah. So even though writers have sought to puff out these legends, there were a lot of stories, and even Rudyard Kipling tells the tale of a ghost of a Mooncuss captain singing out yo-ho across Monomoy when it was in the mood. And tales also went, there's an old woman on Cape Cod with a brick in a sock waiting for your ship to wreck. And dead men tell no tales. Monomoy's reputation continued to terrify sailors so much that in an oft-told tale it's reported that a wrecked mariner would prefer the open sea aboard a plank to coming ashore on Monomoy. And to paraphrase Corbett and others, even today they tell the joke about this shipwrecked wretch who came ashore on the beach clinging weakly to a spar. "Where am I?" he gasped as a couple of inhabitants came up to him. "Monomoy." "Monomoy, my God!" cried the horrified man and paddled briskly out to sea again. So, he may or may not have been mooncussed, but that's how bad their rep was. So there was also regular old piracy. If you didn't want to drudge at hoeing the land or dare the death that whaling could bring, or fish for cod, or trap or trade for furs, or be a soldier in the North during our many wars during the colonial period, you could be a pirate. And at first, piracy was actually, how can I say this, sanctioned by the state, because we had privateers. And privateering was hard to tell from piracy during the Revolution and during the wars in between and around going on in Europe and with England. And while we were still a part of England, there were many of them. And given wars with Spain and so forth, you could be given a letter of marque by your own country encouraging you to covertly perform small wars against hostile countries, and that was privateering. So the unlicensed practice of taking ships, that was considered piracy, as was the taking of your own country's vessels. It's complicated, and this is a practice over which Black Bellamy's partner in the infamous Witta split with him. Were they going to be privateers or were they going to be privateers or pirates? So privateering, unlike piracy, was for gentlemen. And Englishmen actually used honorable men like Captain Kidd to chase the illicit pirates in the West Indies, and then they set them up for a hanging while taking control of the loot in the name of the law. Blackbeard, too, began as a privateer, and all of these pirates did come to the Cape, which is why I'm mentioning them. And he looted from New England to Virginia and the West Indies and back to North Carolina, where he was caught and hanged. Bellamy thought of himself as a Robin Hood, and before the Witta crashed on the shoals of Wellfleet, one of his great quotes was, "They, the rich, and their government and their laws vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under cover of law, forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." He was a revolutionary, you could argue. So the Cape had its share of pirates harboring here, of not land pirates, but ocean pirates. We had Captain Kidd, we had Bellamy, Sam Bellamy, we had Blackbeard, and Kidd allegedly buried treasure on Hogg's Island in Pleasant Bay. Kidd and Blackbeard allegedly buried treasure off Sampson's Island, off of Katuitt. Kidd off of No Man's Land in Martha's Vineyard. And there's another great tale that a Hannah Screech helped these pirates bury their treasure, and she lived in now the very posh Oyster Bay. But then she murdered those who helped her bury the treasure, and her ghost still guards the treasure. So we should look under the Coke house maybe and see. Sorry. So the treasure, there's treasure at Chatham Light, which an Arthur Doane saw pirates bury. He waited, dug it up, and would sell a few coins a year to a friend, the story went. And E.R. Snow, the author who was one of our famous maritime authors, himself found over 400 gold pieces in a copper chest on Nauset Beach. While dragging for anchors lost in storms near Cape Cod, Massachusetts in 1879, a Captain Nickerson and his crew, not the same one as Ansel, caught onto something very heavy. It took every man to get it to the top, where they could see that it was a chest made of copper or brass. The chest weighed around 900 pounds and was, they guessed, full of gold or silver. However, it tore loose before they could get it aboard their boat, and it slipped back into the water. By the time a diver could be sent out to search for it, the ever-changing sands of Cape Cod covered every trace of the heavy chest. I love that. So I mentioned the political reasons, and just to add a little footnote to that, pirates and French privateers had been in our waters from the 1690s. During and between the wars in Canada, the plunder by the French of our whaling sloops in the Gulf of Maine, and by the Spanish of our coasters in the West Indies and in the Gulf of Mexico, reached an all-time high. And from the late 1740s through the 1760s, at least, incident after incident took place, so much so that many Cape vessels stopped going north for whales and cod. So again, it mightn't have been deemed a bad thing to lure a French or a Spanish vessel ashore to wreck. However, and this is really important, most of the time Cape Codders helped. Most of the time, instead of harming, and again, there was no proof of mooncussing, Native Americans have been known to help vessels at dangerous narrows by guiding them with rushlights. There were, as I mentioned, real pilotages such as the 19th century's Old Betty. And then in 1787, the famed Highland Lighthouse was erected in Truro. And by the 1820s, many lighthouses were saving lives and guiding ships. And they were putting a crimp in any mooncussing that might have taken place. But in my radio play, my land pirates find a way around that. And they find a way around, they also find a way to target vessels and find out what cargo the vessels are carrying, so they could actually hit those particular vessels. And by the 1780s, life stations were formalized into a life-saving service up and down the Cape, with 9 life stations, 3 more built by the end of the 1800s, 1 more at Monomoy in the 1900s after the wreck of the Wadena. And life stations saved thousands upon thousands of lives. And again, if you want to read more about that, you can go to Dalton, Lifesavers of Cape Cod, and more about the shipwrecks of Cape Cod. You can go to Isaac Small, who wrote in the late 1800s a wonderful book, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod. And you can also go to the United States Life-Saving Service reports themselves. They talk of rescues in their books. And if I have time, I may read one. So before these formalized life-saving services, citizens really would respond. They would come out to calls of "Oh, wreck" up and down the beaches, and wrecked sailors would be cared for in people's parlors, occasionally even settling in where they'd been saved. I love this. I think I got this from Eleanor Henderson's diary. I can't remember, but there was a Captain Lawson who was saved on Monomoy in around 1801 or 2, right before the first Humane Society hut went up on the Cape. And it reports, the report about his gale-swept and abandoned ship, it says, "The foremast, by the violence of the striking, breaking in 2 places, we then beat over the shoal and drove up on the beach, but we could not discover anything. At 3 a.m., we trod down the snow sufficiently to keep ourselves from freezing. Then the sailors, walking about 4 miles on the long beach, became feeble. One, having lost his mittens in the surf, became helpless. Another changed color from white to purple. And finally, saved by the few Monomoy inhabitants, they were transported to Chatham to be unfrozen by an application of heated blankets. And Lawson claimed the inhabitants stole not one thing of him." So some people have said that having to make that claim. There's a great tale of the bark Francis in Isaac Small's book, and that wrecked legitimately. It was not mooncussed, but it was kind of typical of what happened on the Cape. Cape Codders, this was before the life-saving services, came all the way across from the bay side of Truro over to the ocean side. They had to go through snowdrifts. They brought horses. They brought carts. It was really arduous and worth reading. And they saved a number of the crew. But then, after the spoils landed ashore from the bark Francis, they took a lot of them for themselves, and they were allowed to go on board. I forget whether it was the captain who was still alive, but they were allowed to go on board to help to salvage the major cargo, which was sugar. And they would salvage it, but they also said, you can bring your lunch pail aboard, and you can take a lunch pail of sugar back with you as payment. Well, as the days went on, the pails got bigger and bigger. So, generosity on the one hand and a little for yourself on the other. I love this account of the October 20th, 1886, the Hattie B. Kelsey schooner, a Monomoy life-saving service wreck report. And this is just to let you know how dire things could be. "We were keeping a constant watch upon the vessel, as we thought it probable that he would call for assistance. Judging from his maneuvers, as soon as the flag was set, we started. The wind blowing fresh at the time, and after we started, it increased in force to a gale. The vessel having lost her jib boom, and consequently most of her head sail, the captain was not certain she'd work. We told him the vessel would work, and we would pilot him out of the way of the ice and in smooth water. And he decided to get underway. We took hold, and in a few moments later, we had sail on her and the anchor up. We had about 3 miles to go directly to windward, but as the current was in our favor, we made good progress and anchored near Monomoy Light at 11:30 a.m. Well, that's not so horrific as many of the accounts, but I kind of like that one. Another thing they did to help protect life from wrecks and help out sailors that might have been wrecked was to erect in 1802 Humane Huts through the Massachusetts Humane Society. And there's a lot about that. I'm looking at my time. I want to get to talk about the Mooncusser's tale a little bit. There were a lot of those huts. They had supplies if you were wrecked. And on board the ships, the vessels would be often a Blunt's coastal pilot, which would give you directions to get to these huts. And it was such a wilderness on the Cape in those days that some of the reports, and I use a little bit of this in the Mooncusser's tale, talk about how difficult it was to get through the dunes and through the forest to find your hut. And then Thoreau talks about how those huts were left in terrible disrepair. So even if you did find one, you'd still be in pretty bad shape. Far away in some lonely, desolate hollow by the seaside, just within the bank, stands a lonely building on piles driven into the sand, in which a freezing man can bend, with some straw perchance on the floor in which he may lie, or burn in the fireplace to keep him alive. But these appeared to be just a stage to the grave. So the salvagers who salvaged, again, they were called wreckers, and again, Thoreau has a great description of one. It's really famous. A regular Cape Cod man with whom we parleyed, with a bleached and weather-beaten face, within whose wrinkles I distinguished no particular feature. It was like an old sail, endowed with life, a hanging cliff of weather-beaten flesh, like one of the clay boulders which occurred in that sandbank. He looked as if he sometimes saw a donut, but never descended to comfort, too grave to laugh, too tough to cry, as indifferent as a clam. So why did I want to make a play about mooncussing? And here's where I'm going to just drift through these images. Because it's these images of the Cape that called to me and made me want to write a play that would encompass some of the themes that we face even today on Cape Cod. And those themes in large part have to do with those who love and live within the bounds of the natural world, and those who can't stand them. These bounds drive them mad, and they want to use the natural world against their fellow man. That's a predominant theme in the Mooncusser's tale. The imagery, and it is very much an imagist play, although it has quite a traditional plot with a beginning, middle, and an end, and family conflict. These images are ones that I have been seeing since I was a very little girl. I didn't grow up here, but I've been coming here since I was 3. And they express themselves in the language of the play. And these are obviously places where mooncussing could have taken place. There could have been a beacon up on that bluff to mislead ships. There could have been a walk over these back dunes. And my young hero, we passed, by the way, further back, the young man who plays the lead in the Mooncusser's tale. I should mention that we were lucky enough to have a real family play Captain Ephraim Bowers, his dead wife Salome Bowers, and their son, Mark Bowers, their 14-year-old son. We had the Paul Schuyler, Jade Schuyler, and Quinn Schuyler, a real acting and writing family on the Cape, play those. It's really fabulous. And then we had Rod Owens play Captain Ephraim Bowers' brother, Solomon Bowers, who was maybe not the Mooncusser. You have to listen to it to find out. So we have the lighthouses coming into play and disturbing the trade of the Mooncussers. We have some of the merchant wealth that one of my characters and many characters in the 19th century and still today aspire to. And these old harbors wherein Captain Ephraim Bowers' schooner, the Bayberry, which was a coastal trader that went up and down the coast trading in bayberries for soap and candles, might have been moored when he was at home. We have these small halfway houses, the Humane Huts, or facsimiles thereof, that play into the Mooncussers' tale as a place where the bad guys meet because they're so desolate. Nobody's going to go there. Nobody's going to bother with them. And we have the wonderful houses of the 1800s and 19th century on Cape Cod, and the mysterious locales where Mark Bowers goes hunting or wanders through to go clamming or goes through to find out what his uncle might be doing in one of those small houses. And we have in the play A Trip to Boston, which is the urban contrast to the peace and quiet of the wilderness that was mid-19th century Cape Cod. And that also is a metaphor and a theme in the play, because Captain Ephraim Bowers really prefers it out here and doesn't very much like the civilization that's encroaching on him and that threatens him and his existence. Some of these black and white photos are quite old, and they are courtesy of Cape Cod National Seashore. I appreciate that. So all of these, and I'll just tool on right through them, we also were very much more pastoral then, as well as maritime. So in the Mooncusser's tale, there's a contrast. There's a little reference to the more pastoral life that's going on around the maritime life during this era. And what I found after I had written the Mooncusser's tale, and it took a long time to get the actors together, to get it taped with the help of Cape Cod Community Media Center, to get it edited, and Paul Schuyler has a studio, and he helped do the editing, and Jay Sheehan helped do the editing. Finally, to get it all together with sound effects and get it out there. And then we were lucky enough to win a couple of awards. We got a Brewster Cultural Council grant. We won a silver award from the National Audio Theater Festival for it, in competition with a lot of really good people, so I was very proud of that. That's actually from one of the first, an edition of Thoreau's Cape Cod, that picture. There's the pastorality that they think about. And the house they might have lived in. I pictured that as the house that they might have lived in, up on a bluff, overlooking the ponds area of Wellfleet. So what I found after I did the play was I started doing some reading of other maritime literature, and there was a likeness in many respects, because the way of life and the imagery corresponds with that in Maine and in other coastal areas. The idea that that these people understood solitude, they could deal with being alone, they were a very hardy and courageous breed. And there's a kind of quintessential maritime gestalt. One of the quotes that I like is from The Yankee Coast by R.P.T. Coffin. "The men were in the sea up to their eyes. They don't run after tinsel goods and gods. the sea makes them what they are, a good neighbor to infinity. They're not too close together to poison one another. So I think I'll end on that because we are running out of time. I'd love to play you just the first couple of lines, if we could do that, if Corey's here, as I run this, of the radio play. And then I'd like to just open this up to questions, if I could.
Turn off your lights, stoke the fire in your hearths, and let a ghost tell you a tale. And to you, Sally Delamere, asleep in the empty house in front of a stone hearth where a strange blue flame which is not warm lingers. Go home. Your parents will worry. I understand your tears, for if what in this tale had not happened, you and I would have been wed someday. Would I could wipe those tears away. Know well that Cape Cod house of my father's, Captain Ephraim Bowers, built before the Revolution, way back on the beach of Wellfleet in Newcomb's Hollow, on a bluff protected by high dunes.
100 yards away is the
All
sea.
right.
In the middle of
Thank
a
you.
maelstrom of creation, the house is alone for miles above a curve of long gray sand, set well.
So yubbity yubbity, that's all, folks, except for questions. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
Well, I don't know the answer to this, but where can one find the Mooncussers tale?
At WOMR.org, go to podcasts, go to the archive for podcasts. It's up there. No one else? All right. Thank you very much for coming.